Welcome back to Coloring Through the Bible. My name is Keegan Harkins, and we're finishing up, well, not really, there's still another week after this one, but we're continuing on our study of the book of Ruth. Today we're going to be looking at Ruth Chapter 3, and we're going to be talking about how we don't have to understand to be obedient. We don't have to understand everything that God is calling us to do. We just have to trust God enough to know that whatever it is, He's prepared us for it. And if He's leading us, He's going to lead us through it. He's going to use it to train us or to bless us. But whatever it is, it's for our benefit. And that takes trust. It's hard to obey when we don't understand. I think that's the first thing I always want to know is why, God? I mean, how many times is that our prayer? Why? Why? When things don't turn out the way that we think that they should, that's like the first thing we cry out, why? But we don't have to know why. We have to know who. Do we trust that God is in control? Because if God is in control, then even though it doesn't make sense to us, even though we don't know the why, even though we don't know how this could be for our benefit, if we trust that God is in control, then we can face anything that life throws at us. And this is what chapter 3 in the book of Ruth really speaks to me as I read it. We start off in the first 6 verses of this chapter, and Naomi, Ruth's mother-in-law, asks her to do something that is just completely strange. She tells her to, get all dressed up, put on your best clothes, put on perfume, look real pretty, and then go down to the threshing floor where, they've just finished harvest. So this is a time when all of the men workers would be celebrating. They would be having a party. It would, just be men, just being men. And she tells her daughter-in-law to go get all pretty up and go down there. And then she tells her, if we say, let's start in verse 4. When he lies down, talking about Boaz, take note of where he's lying. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what to do. And Ruth says in verse 5, I will do whatever you say. So she went down to the threshing floor and did everything her mother-in-law told her to do. What a strange request. Go down to this place all prettied up where all of these men have been partying all night long because they're celebrating the end of the harvest. Find out where this guy is sleeping. As soon as he falls asleep, sneak over there, uncover his feet and lay down. And then don't worry, he'll tell you what to do. I mean, Ruth obviously has no idea what this symbolizes. She doesn't know what this practice is. Remember, she's not an Israelite. She's from the country of Moab. So this is a custom that she's not familiar with. And we get that she's not familiar with it because Naomi says, he will tell you what to do. So obviously Ruth doesn't know what to do. But even though she doesn't know what it is that her mother-in-law is asking her to do, she can kind of understand that it's somehow she's asking Boaz to marry her, but she doesn't really know all that it means or what she's supposed to do, but she's still obedient to her. She doesn't even think twice. She's like, okay, I'm going to do it. And she does it exactly the way her mother-in-law told her to do it. Wouldn't it be wonderful if that was the reaction we had to God? Even though we may not understand it, even though it may seem strange, maybe even scandalous. I mean, think about this. This was a place where only men were, and she's all gussied up. I mean, you could really get the wrong impression. Her virtue could be put into question, but she was obedient, even though she didn't understand. What an inspiration. How many times do I want to know the who, what, when, where, why before I take a step forward? And Ruth is saying, hey, I trust you, therefore I'm going to do what you said. She had ultimate trust in her mother-in-law. She knew her mother-in-law wasn't going to ask her to do something that would put her in danger or would harm her or her reputation. And so because she trusted her, she was obedient. If we trust the Lord the way that we are always saying we trust the Lord, then that's the kind of obedience we should have, even if it doesn't make sense. The other thing I wanted to point out was that God is never going to ask us to do something He hasn't prepared us for. Even in this situation, we've already seen a lot about Ruth's character. We already know that she's a really bold person. She's strong. She's a fighter. She works hard. I mean, she is not a weak little flower. She is a very strong woman. And it would take a very bold person to be able to do this. I mean, she's essentially proposing to Boaz in a culture when that's not the norm. That's really kind of scandalous. And yet she doesn't even blink an eye. And God had been preparing her whole life and giving her those character traits to do what he called her to do. And that's the same thing he does with us. There's nothing he is going to call us to do that he hasn't prepared us for, that we aren't built specifically to be able to conquer it. So just let that be an encouragement to you when you don't understand where God's calling you to go. Just remember, hey, if he's calling me to go there, then I must be able to do it. And put one step in front of the other, because you trust the one telling you to go, not because you understand what you're going to do when you get there. Let's move on. Let's look at verses 7 through 9. So 7 through 9, now Ruth has gone. She's uncovered his feet. She's laid down. And now Boaz wakes up and he sees her there. And I want to read what transpires when he wakes up and sees her laying at his uncovered feet. So let's just read verses 9 through 11. Who are you? He asks. So, I mean, it's the middle of the night. He's had some, maybe he's had too much to drink. He's been partying all night and it's dark in there. And he's like, whoa, there's somebody laying at my feet. Who are you? And Ruth says, I am your servant Ruth, she said. Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a kinsman redeemer. Right there, she's asking him to marry her. That's what that symbolizes. She's saying, hey, you're my kinsman redeemer. Remember, we talked about that last week. He's a close relative who could marry her, pay off her debt, give her children. I mean, everything that she needed for security, he's able to give it to her. Verse 10. The Lord bless you, my daughter, he replied. This kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. If you have not run after the younger men, whether rich or poor, and now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I will do for you all that you ask. All my fellow townsmen know that you are a woman of noble character. This response from Boaz tells us a lot about Boaz. First of all, we can tell right away, we already pretty much knew that Ruth was a young woman. But now we know that Boaz isn't. He is, well, we knew he wasn't a woman, but we know that he's not a young man, because he's saying you could have run after a younger man. So he's an older guy. He's already, he's already lived a full life. He's quite a bit older than Ruth. He keeps calling her my daughter. So this kind of gives us an indication of the age difference between these two. But I want to take a look at Boaz's obedience and faithfulness that maybe you might miss when we first read it. But when we think about him being an older guy, we think one of two things. He's either a widower or he's never been married. Either way, something didn't turn out the way that he thought it should. Maybe things didn't turn out the way he had planned. If he got married as a young man, which most men would have done, then his wife died, because now he's single, he's able to marry. His hopes and dreams didn't turn out the way that he thought they were going to. If he never married, obviously he wants to be married, because man, he jumps on Ruth's offer really quickly. So he might have been wondering, God, why am I waiting? Why isn't there someone for me? How many times are we in Boaz's position when what we thought was going to be our future doesn't work out? When what we want to be our future never shows up. And sometimes we can start to get bitter. We can get complainy and whiny and be like, God, why? Again, that why question. And all the time we're asking why, we're admitting that we don't trust him, which that's hard, because why is one of my first responses, but it's the truth. When we're saying why and God explain it to me, we're showing that we don't trust that he knows what he's doing, and he does. And the fact that Boaz never complained, he's not a bitter man. We can see he's a kind man. We've seen in the other chapters that he's well liked, he's well respected in the community. He cares about the people who work for him. He cares about the poor. He's just this really great guy. So he didn't allow his either death of his wife or never having a wife make him bitter. He trusted God. And maybe God's timing isn't what we think it should be. I'm sure that Boaz didn't want to wait until he was an old man to find love and happiness. But God said, I have a plan. Just the same way Naomi and Ruth didn't want to be, have a widow so young, or, so lose your husband and your children. That wasn't their plan. But God knew that the paths of these people were on track to do exactly what he designed them to do. And I love that. I love that Boaz didn't have to understand. Ruth didn't have to understand. They just obeyed and walked by faith. It's a total inspiration. I love it. That's what I want to be like. That's what I want to do. I want to say, yes, God, even when it doesn't make sense. So let's move on and finish this up. Verses 12 through 18. Verses 12 through 18, Boaz tells us that, yes, he is a kinsman redeemer, but there's one guy who's actually more closely related. So he actually gets first dibs. So he follows the letter of the law. He doesn't, say, hey, you proposed and I can marry you. Let's just do it. He wants to make sure he's doing it right. He wants to make sure that her honor is upheld, that he maintains that right standing. God's never going to ask us to do something that goes against the law, that goes against what we should do. He's never going to tell us to do something that breaks his law. And this was a law that God had given the people for how to live. Because God doesn't sin, so he's never going to tell us to sin. He's never going to tell us to do something that the Bible tells us don't do. So that's a good indication on whether we're listening to the right voices. Does it line up with God's word? If it does, then that's what you're supposed to do. And he even says, you know what? If this guy doesn't do it, I will do it. I will marry you. So he says, first, let's make sure this is truly God's will, because if it's God's will, it's going to line up with the law and it's going to work out. But I want to kind of focus a little bit just on just the ending of this real quick. We're going to talk about this on the worksheets. If you want those free worksheets that go with this lesson, they're on the website, Hebrews4ministries.com. Print them off for free. They're just a PDF. But I wanted to point out that when Boaz sends Ruth on her way, he fills up her shawl with all this grain, barley, I think it was, and tells her, take this home. And Ruth takes it home to Naomi and points out that Boaz gave her these 6 measures of barley, saying, don't go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed. So this is kind of a present for Naomi, because not only is Boaz going to take care of Ruth in this action, he's promising to take care of and provide for Naomi as well. Sometimes God calls us to go above and beyond what's expected of us. But I love that their faithfulness and their obedience is rewarded, and not just rewarded, but over and abundantly rewarded. When we are obedient to what God calls us to do, he's going to over and abundantly reward us. That's pretty cool. I mean, it's a win-win. We know that if he's telling us to do it, we have the power to do it. We have the capability of doing it. If he's telling us to do it, we know that it's going to be upheld in his word. And if he's telling us to do it and we obey without why and whining, he's going to bless our obedience. So I hope that you guys can be inspired by Ruth chapter 3 to not ask why, demand answers, ask for God's PowerPoint presentation on why you should do what he says to do. Trust him and act like you trust him by doing what he says. Thanks for spending some time with me today. I hope that you guys have been encouraged. I encourage you to read all of Ruth chapter 3 today and just kind of spend some time letting it speak to your heart and seeing what God has for you hidden in this chapter. Till I see you guys next week, have a truly blessed week.